90s, and the easy answer, if you want to put in easy terms, is that the 80s and 90s were a period of not only political but social and cultural restoration, like it happened in many other countries and periods of history. You know, like when you have not only a political revolution but also like a cultural revolution, which is quite strong, usually tends to be followed by a period of counter-revolution. And the Negrians, the post-workerists, rightly so call it counter-revolution. You know, if the generation of my mother was the first generation when women, exactly, I mean, went down the street saying, we want a law on abortion, you know, 100,000 people in 1969, 1972. If you then, 20 years later, you have actually a mass mediatic bombardment on television of a certain image of woman reduced to an object, which was actually what Berlusconi's television lived on, then clearly the following, if not the following generation, but the generation after, goes back having like very, very reactionary and patriarchal values. Yes. Did I answer to your point?
Yes, but
yeah.
Okay. Shall we give you to continue?
Yeah, I would like to actually finish.
May I ask you,
Sure.
While the society was very progressive,
Yeah.
why did Red Brigades took these radical steps?
Because they thought the easy answer is because they thought it was not enough. I mean, the plan was quite. I mean, Red Brigades have different. I worked quite a lot years ago from a historical perspective on the Red Brigades. There are different periods because it started out in I think 69, and then the last fightings, the last imprisonments were as late as 1985. So it's like a 15, 16 years phenomenon, and there are different phases. That is to say, they become increasingly militarized and violent. At first it was, for instance, they had a lot of show kidnapping. So say in a factory you have like a manager who is a dick, just to be very stupid. You know, like you are an hour late and you're sacked, etc., etc. So there were a lot of show kidnapping. I mean, they used to, you know, take the guy, undress him, interrogate him, film him, and then tie him naked to the gates of the factory, and that was it. I mean, nobody was killed, etc., etc. So there was a lot of kind of like almost, how should I say, aesthetic value in these actions, yeah. And then it became more and more violent, in a sense. And it became more and more violent. It became more violent as the more society was becoming again reactionary. You know, like when they felt that they were losing the battle completely, that they didn't have any support in a wider context, they resorted to, you know, nihilistically, we could say, to arms. But the question is why they wanted to take it that far.
So the reaction of the government was before they took radical steps?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, and that also implied like the passing of very, very police state laws. You know, like, okay, again, in the state of exception, clearly, you know, Nazism, etc., etc., but there are very specific laws that were passed in Italy against the Red Brigades and terrorism or support towards a communist revolution. Because the question, to answer your question very quickly, originally, when it was still not that militarized, it was not just the Red Brigades. This is the most explicit group. There are other groups, like even more interesting in a sense, theoretically and culturally. The question is why things were going so well in a way. They wanted to take the further step because they thought that there were sufficient grounds to create a communist revolution in Italy. So, if you want to say historically, I think the closest kind of cultural phenomenon would be Spartakism in the 20s in Germany. Yeah, they saw that they thought that there was sufficient reason to create a communist revolution in a Western democracy. Were they right? No. In the sense that were there sufficient conditions for that? No. Was Italy close to that? Maybe yes. You know, and did they do the right things? No, clearly. I mean, even strategically, no. But what we call before the strategy of tension is precisely this. I mean, the escalation into violence was, in a sense, promoted by certain fringes of the state. So if I actually kidnap you and actually we make a show trial and nobody gets hurt, etc., but it's still symbolically important. And the next time actually, I don't know, a policeman gets killed and the radical left is blamed, but they didn't kill him. Maybe the next time you actually kidnap somebody and maybe wound him. You know, this is the kind of logic, and that's why it's called the strategy of tension. And it was very effective because the Italian state managed to this is like another strong political point of the worker, the post-workers now. In a sense, the movement, the Italian difference, the anomaly, was demonized through terrorism. You know, if you ask people, are you for terrorism? The answer is no. So, certain reactionary strata of, if not the government, close to the government, managed to actually associate in the course of 10 years, symbolically, the radical left, non-violent, with terrorism. And although there was a connection, it was a minimal connection, because most of the people did not took arms, you see. But this is... Yeah. Okay, we have half an hour left, and I'm really happy to have more general discussions like this, but I would also like to, you know, say something more specific about some thinkers, so that when you read this stuff, then it doesn't seem too theoretical and ungrounded. Now, Esposito. He wrote an entire book, which is entitled Living Thought, subtitled Origins and Actuality of Italian Philosophy. You should be able to download it from the internet. It was translated into English by Stanford, so it's really easy of labor. No, you cannot?
Well, the only thing I could manage to find is the biggest part is on Google Books, but it's still not the whole book.
Okay. So we have to ask that buy a copy of all this, you know, and so you have it in the library.
Living Thought. Living Thought.
Sorry?
The name of the book. Living Thought.
Yes, Living Thought. Origins and Actuality of Italian Philosophy. So, what is Esposito's take on Italian theory? And he calls it Italian theory. Well, first of all, he uses a lot this phrase. You know, he says, "I am one of the thinkers of Italian theory," and he says it abroad a lot. So there's a kind of self-identification. He's promoting internationally this idea that yes, indeed, right now there is a strong, in his opinion, radical, I don't think it is, leftist political thought, which is Italian. What kind of take does he have? He has a more philosophical take and genealogical than Negri. In what sense genealogical? So still connected with Foucault, right? A certain way of looking back into history to uncover trends which are not so visible according to official history, if you want to define in general terms genealogy. So the thesis is the following, the thesis of this book. Italian thought has always been, since Machiavelli, so we go back in time quite a lot, since Machiavelli, and up to Gramsci, so 20th century, Pasolini and Tronti, so the entirety of this long tradition, heterogeneous tradition of political thought, has been always in a problematic and conflictive relationship to politics and power. So this is a very wide thesis. Italian political thought as such, starting with Machiavelli, has always been in a conflictive relation to politics and power. Because of this opposition to any kind of constituted power, Italian political thought has always privileged the category of life over that of language. Life as an excess with respect to power. you like a quote. Esposito says, Italian thought has always put into question the transcendental primacy of language. Language is not what comes first. It reconstructs the relationship that links language to biological life and the mobile order of history. It's quite abstract in a sense. So there is a continuity with Esposito in the sense that you have like this philosophical presupposition that there is a primacy of life over power. But there is still, more specifically, the idea that Italian political thought gets its originality since Machiavelli, so a long time back, right? From privileging the excess of life over, well, language, but then constituted power, in a way. This is very problematic. I just anticipated, and I will make some criticism. Now, Esposito senses one problem here. If you go around and say, Italian theory is the political theory of the moment, and I'm one of its biggest representatives, apart from being a bit self-indulgent, the problem is that you have to account how you're not falling back into the idea of a nationalist philosophy. If you're saying that, yes, I mean, even if this political thought allegedly existing for, 500 years more since Machiavelli has indeed, according to Esposito, shown to be resistant to power, you also have to show that this is not something which goes back to the idea of a nationalist philosophy. I mean, why Italian? It's really problematic, isn't it? He senses this problem, and he thinks he finds a solution to the problem, saying, basically saying, no, it's the opposite. What I call Italian theory, since Machiavelli, has nothing to do with nationalist philosophy. He says it like that, nothing to do. It actually finds, and I quote, its most authentic reason precisely in the distance from its national role. You know, it's begging the question, isn't it? He also says, nothing intrinsic or profound bounds Italian philosophy to our nation. But then the stupid objection is, why Italian? Apart from the fact that, you know, some thinkers in the course of 500 years share a certain geographical, if not ethnic, which is also very difficult category to apply, proximity. Now, let's go on with his reasoning, and then we will criticize him. So, why would Italian theory not be a nationalist philosophy, but find its most authentic reason in the distance from its national role? Why can Esposito say that? Well, the answer is pretty weak, I think, because he says, well, because Italy is a young nation. This is a matter of fact. Italy was unified in 1861. Italy existed for millennia. I mean, the connection, of course, then totally manipulated by fascism. There is a connection with the ancient Roman Empire, clearly, you know, in the language, etc., etc. But Italian as a culture, Italian culture, existed without a nation state. Italy became a nation state in 1861, so very, very late. You know, if you take, if you take Russia, if you take England, if you take France, you know, there's a big difference. So, this is what allows Esposito to say, there is Italian theory, but it's not a nationalist philosophy. It's actually the opposite of a nationalist philosophy, because there was never a nation to begin with. And when the nation was founded, that is to say 150 years ago, it was still a weak nation. It is still a weak nation. You know, we have separatists everywhere. Now we do speak the same language, but this is like an historical acquisition of the last, made possible by television, by the economic boom. Up until the generation of my parents or grandparents, Italians from the north, Italians from the south, or even Italians from different parts of the north could not talk to each other. You know, the dialects were so different that clearly we all speak the same language, but no, you see. So, do you see like the reasoning of Esposito? I've already problematize, but you see like what he says. So, in a way, this tradition has been able to resist power because they gave a primacy to life over power, or over language. But language and power here are interchangeable in a sense. Nevertheless, Italian theory is not a national or a nationalist philosophy. It's the contrary. It's actually, it finds its raison d'être precisely in the distance from its national role. And how can you claim something so apparently paradoxical? And the answer is, for him, because Italy has become a nation only very recently in relative terms, and it still is a quite weak nation in terms of what a modern state nation is. So, and this will be the last point in his reasoning, which needs to be problematized, what happened is that a deficit, a political deficit, even an anomaly, he says this term, but it's not a Negri's anomaly, that is to say, the lack of a stable national situation, this deficit, historical deficit, political deficit, turned into an advantage when it came to thinking politics. So, this is maybe the most interesting point in terms of the history of ideas, political ideas, he's making, Esposito. So, why can Italian theory think resistance better than other national traditions, and we're not talking about the national philosophy? Because these thinkers have always lived in a kind of pre-state dimension, he says. So, it's been easier to think resistance to the state. I'm not totally persuaded at all. One could actually argue the opposite. That it's precisely when you're faced as a thinker to a strong state that you actually develop strategies of resistance to a state. But we can discuss that. Is the reasoning clear? I mean, I'm just trying to say what he says. Yes.
Just a small question.
Yeah.
He also has a notion of geophilosophy, and it somehow connected to this, but I didn't understand that point at all. Could you please say what it means and how he puts it?
I think the point there would be to say clearly that you can think political thought also in terms of the different trajectories that different parts of Europe have had in terms of the emergence and development of the nation state. I think this is what it means, if I got him right.
So it's the same point?
It is the same point, but in a sense like in a comparative way. I mean, let's take Italian political theory vis-a-vis French political theory, for instance, where clearly the state dimension has always been very, very strong. I think if I get him right that this is the dimension, or did you have like a more specific question?
No, just
wanted
to ask.
No, it's a good question. I have to I know, and it's in the end of the introduction, isn't it? This geophilosophy thing. The way I understood it is like this. Now I'm saying it, and maybe there is a further twist there, but I'm not sure whether this is what he meant. But he senses the problem. You know, the problem is how can you speak about Italian theory and say this tradition is not really related to a nation because the nation was not there to begin with, and because of that actually we can think resistance to the state in a more effective way. I mean, it's a weak reasoning. I mean, you can follow it, but it's a quite weak reasoning. And of course the last piece in the puzzle would be to say the interest today in Italian theory, ergo in Esposito non-thought, or in Agamben, or in Negri, is because now we are globally experiencing the waning of the nation state. That would be Italian theory is topical because it's fought for centuries what is going now on globally. And this is also a bit shaky, I think. But do you understand this point? From a more philosophical perspective, Esposito then singles out three main axes of Italian thought to cool from Machiavelli onwards, which he thinks are still particularly topical today in the epoch of the waning of the modern state in a global sense. And the first one, I'm using his phrases, is what he calls the immanentization, so the rendering immanent of antagonism. So his claim is that Italian political thought has always thought conflict as not an exception to order, but as constitutive of order. Italian political thought has always not aimed, according to Esposito, at reaching an order that excludes conflict, and tracks that down also in Machiavelli, for instance. But then the question is, what is conflict? And again, here he goes back, Esposito goes back to the idea of life. The fact that life cannot be contained wholly within history. So, I repeat this point because it's a bit more theoretical. So, what does Italian thought think? What has it thought for centuries? And why is this kind of thought relevant globally today? One, because of the immanentization of antagonism. So the rendering immanent antagonism. Antagonism, it doesn't speak about class struggle, but one could say also class struggle. Antagonism is not an exception to the political order. It is constitutive. Conflict is constitutive. So this is something Italian thought would have thought from the beginning. So the aim of political thought should not be that of envisioning an order that excludes conflict. And this, again, according to him, is something which Italian thought has thought from Machiavelli up to Gramsci, up to Pasolini and Tronti. Conflict, in the end, signals what? Signals something which resists history and political power. And that is life, according to Esposito. So we go back to, again, a very vitalist ontology. The power of life is excessive and prevails ultimately, cannot be contained by constituted power. The second main axis which makes Italian thought in this long trajectory from Machiavelli to our days relevant today globally is what he calls, and it's a very similar point, he calls it the historicization, the rendering historical of the non-historical. And again, history, according to him, is always in an immanent history and hence constitutive power, is always in an immanent relationship to a non-historical element. And again, that is life, according to Esposito. So there is always a tension between history and constitutive power, and life as an element which is always given in kind of antinomic relation to history and constitutive power. It's the same point we made before, in a way. There is a dialectics between power, constitutive power, history, so the sequence of constitutive power, and life. There is an immanent dialectic, and constitutive power tries in vain to contain life, or better, the power of life, in a way. Yeah? And the third point is what he calls the mondanization of the subject. Mondanization, so the making worldly of the subject. And here the idea is that it's even more based on in a way, life and vitalism. The idea is that political subjects are always given as living singularities. So there is a corporeal dimension, a biological dimension of political subjectivity. Do you understand this point? So again, they're all very close to each other, the 3 points. Yeah? So in a sense, when you think political subjectivity, clearly, if you want to think politics, you have to think political agency, right? Who is the agent of a politics, okay? And here, Esposito is insisting on the fact that the political subject is, anyways, whatever way you think it politically, first and foremost, a living singularity. So communality has always a corporeal dimension, a biological corporeal dimension. This would be the point. If you're not convinced, I agree, because I'm not convinced either.
It means it's more about personalities, but not about institutions.
No. It's more about the biology of subjects rather than the political. I mean, the political agency of subjects, or the getting together, the communality of subjects. The political dimension of subjectivity. If you take a subject and you say, this is a political subject, and then there's another, and then you have, let's say, to use a Espositian term, a community, political community. That political community is nevertheless, first and foremost, an ensemble of living singularities. Politically, we are still biological entities. This is the point. It's not the prevalence of the singular over the universal. No, it's not this point. The point is that political subjectivity, the agency of the political, should be thought always with regard to what makes it possible. That is to say, corporeality in the end. Corporeality in the sense of, well, it goes back to life in a way. The fact that we are living entities, basically. You know, this is very close in a sense to the distinction between Zoe, the dialectic between Zoe and bios in Agamben. You know, like, there's always a naked life in politics, which is nothing but pre-political, in a way. What is the big problem here? Because I won't have time to go in detail into my objections, because tomorrow definitely we move to Pasolini. What is the problem here? The problem here is that, okay, you say, when you think the political subject, you also have to think it's biology. Let's put it like that. The fact it's a living entity, yeah? But then the question is, don't you risk to lose the very notion of political agency? This is and I think this is the very least objection to Esposito.
Is agency always a communal or not?
No, communitas, community, in a new way, is
not personal,
a political notion that he tries to redevelop. But my problem here is that if you overemphasize the pre-political in the political, the risk is that you could lose the very possibility of thinking political agency. If we privilege life in politics, if you have a primacy of life over politics, I mean, conceptually, how can you then think political subjectivity as something which is not merely biological? You know, to the best of our knowledge, I mean, well, you go back to Aristotle, I mean, we are the political animal. It's not the fact that we are animals that makes us political. It is language. You see, there's, of course, here I'm laying my cards on the table. I mean, I'm not a vitalist at all. I mean, I still believe in dialectics, actually. And I think even though life and power are thought dialectically to a certain extent by thinkers like Negri and Esposito, there's a clear prevalence of life. And to put it very generally, I would say there is a risk of irrationalism here. You know, there is such a problem in a way. Yes.
I just wanted to ask a quick question. Why you said that life is an antinomic relation to constituent power, and this is not clear because you would think in the opposite way, because you know.
Constituted, not constituent.
Constituted.
Yeah.
This is what I felt I heard. I must have heard it wrong. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it would make no sense.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is clearly that constituted power, and hence history as a succession of constituted powers, never really contains life, basically.
Yeah.
Even though it cannot but presuppose it and contain it because of the fact that, this was the other point, actually political subjects are nevertheless living biological singularities. Yeah.
Can you please once again state what's community for Esposito? It's like community.
It's a good question. It's really a good question, and I think the answer is actually quite difficult, because it's an idea. It's a community that doesn't have political subjectivity. It's an impersonal He calls it an impersonal community. Huh? There is a critique of the notion of person. He has a book called The Third Person. So we should move in politics from thinking the person, which is for him like a kind of apparatus that always contain and repress life, into an impersonal dimension of politics. But this is precisely my problem and the difficulty in answering your question, because a politics of impersonality runs the risk of losing precisely the idea of political subject. This is not a satisfying answer, but it would be very, very difficult to say. The best I can try to do in such a short span of time is to say he's aiming at the community of impersonality.
So it's a notion of this life. It's not about politics. Community is living subject, not a political subject.
Yeah, I mean, you should not go too far and say, yes, it's non-political, but it's a dimension of politics which is, according to him, inherent to the living singularities. And that should evade being captured by apparatuses such as that of the person. He thinks like he has a long genealogy of what a person is. So we've been thinking politics in a given way because we were not able, you can say, to value the power of life. Because you see, like when you start saying the power of life, you see that actually you're injecting politics into life itself. Clearly here, the other interlocutor about which we haven't talked much is Nietzsche, clearly. Nietzsche's will to power, etc., etc. I want to conclude like 5 minutes by criticizing Esposito a bit further, and then tomorrow we'll start from Pasolini. And most of my personal comments on Italian theory, they came up with the critiques we've already made of other thinkers. I'm aware of the fact we are switching registers quite continuously. We've said a lot about history and Italian politics, etc., in a very concrete sense, and then there are aspects which are much more philosophical. I hope this is okay, because I think given the very general approach we have, I think we should do this. And the subtleties of texts like Esposito, I think when you read the text, then I think the questions will become much, much more well-defined. We cannot be very analytical philosophically, and at the same time, given the context of the Red Brigades, etc., etc. So I hope this works as a kind of like multi-layered approach. So what is the strength and the weakness of what Esposito is proposing? Well, the strength is like the courage to say, dare and attempt to say, to read philosophically, the very recent interest in Italian theory, the reason why we're here, through the prism of a 500-year antagonistic tradition of thought. It is courageous. If you read the entirety of the book, and we don't go into this here, it will take us ages, to find the kind of Machiavelli that he finds, that's interesting. But it's interesting in what sense? In the sense that he knows how to read Machiavelli and find an alternative Machiavelli. Negri did the same years ago. Negri also had a book on Machiavelli. What is the weakness? It's the same point as the strength. Like how can you be speaking about such a broad historical paradigm? How can you say Italian thought as such has been characterized for the last 500 years by a thinking of life that privileges thinking life in politics over the containment of life by politics? Do you understand my point? I mean, I can have like a very original reading of Machiavelli, and then Bruno, Vico, and then we're moving on with the years, we get to Gramsci, Pasolini, etc., etc. You can have a very alternative and convincing textually, in terms of exegesis of a text, reading of an author. But then to put together 500 years of history, first of all, and then of political thought, is problematic. This links back to the question of national philosophy. So Esposito senses the risk of speaking about a national philosophy, yes, And he begs the question trying to solve this problem. Because he's saying Italian philosophy is defined precisely by the fact that there was no Italy and hence no Italian identity. You see, the risk is still there. The risk of referring to a kind of like ethno-geographical substance is still there. Even if you say this substance is void. So it's like a nationalism of those without nation, in a way. So why do Italians do it better politically? This is a stupid question. And to say as an answer, because we didn't have a state first and then we didn't have a strong state, it's still a kind of like nationalist philosophy. And the third point is, and here I agree with Negri, Esposito is very good at actually selecting some noticeable exceptions of thinkers who have been even existentially, Italian thinkers since many 100 years ago, who have been even existentially opposed to power. Think of Bruno, Giordano Bruno. He was killed, he was burned alive. So Gramsci, prison, exile, Pasolini, killed, etc. But again, this is not all of Italian thought. Italian thought is also gentile. Italian thought is also the connivance of refined Hegelian scholars with Mussolini's regime. So this is a straightforward objection to Esposito. I think all they are straightforward in a sense. Like you have a too broad paradigm. How can you put together 500 years? And you are talking nevertheless about the national philosophy. Isn't that a problem? And the third one is Italian thought has not been always, or for the most part, resistant to power. On the contrary, it has been, in a way, supporting established power. This is true of fascism, and more recently, there were many intellectuals who actually spoke up against what we could call the mass mediatic populism of the Berlusconi years. Okay. Any other question? We're trying to cover a lot of material, so I hope it gives a general idea, and then you have time to digest all this information.
Did you say that this idea of primacy of life based on Christianity? Could you tell something more about?
Yeah, this is like what I would have liked to develop in the seminar specifically dedicated to the notion of birth in Esposito, and then in dialogue with the
What happens?
Crazies.
with the debate on abortion, etc., etc. Clearly, if you privilege life as a ontological notion over constitutive power, the risk is also of endorsing a certain spontaneous vitalism, which is also indebted to Christianity, clearly. Esposito's constructive biopolitics, the biopolitics he wanted to construct, and we will try to say something more in the last seminar, revolves around the notion of birth. There is something inherently communal, to go back to your point, hospital, communal in the very biological process of birth. It's a kind of a metaphor, analogy of what gestation and birth, of what political communities should be, i.e. the fact, and he speaks very eloquently about clearly the different genetic material of the fetus in the womb of the mother, the fact that there is an immunization, but there is also a kind of, there is a co-presence of different forms of life genetically. So this kind of debate, to go back to your question, we cannot really tackle specific issues, has, at least implicitly, a quite strong Christian undertone. Of course, vitalism is not necessarily Christian. Clearly, Spinozism comes from elsewhere, but as exposed by, as supported by Esposito, I think there is still a quite strong Christian component. I mean, if you say the ultimate principle is life, and then of course you can take life as a power of life, and life is differential, always excessive. We're not talking in terms of like a one of life, you know, like a kind of like Plotinian, self-contained God. But nevertheless, when you put forward the idea that life as such is a principle, and you don't think dialectically with power, and where in a relationship where you cannot say what comes first, whether life or power, because otherwise you do not have politics. When you put forward that primacy, you're also endorsing a certain form of, well, not necessarily Christianity, but metaphysics, which is deeply theological and religious. Did I partly at least answer to your question?